Is that really the kind of jacket patch you'd mock at dawn? The flag rope clicked softly against the pole as the cold wind scraped the neighborhood gate, and they scoffed at the faded silver threads pressing their doubts into the morning air, without noticing the quiet man fixing what everyone else ignored. But when a small wooden box opened, the light shifted over an old Navy mechanic's wings, and even the silence held its breath with a slow, steady heartbeat. Still quiet, men leave echoes too, let me take you back. The morning air in Maple Ridge carried a thin bite of late November chill, the kind that made the neighborhood gate creak before the sun had fully climbed the roofs. A soft rasp echoed each time the breeze nudged the hinges as if the metal were calling out for a steady hand. Walter Hayes stepped into view just as the wind pushed again. He moved slowly, not from weakness, but from the practiced calm of someone who had fixed more things in his life than he could ever count. His denim jacket faded in the shoulders and, softened by years of use, brushed against the cold rail as he knelt. A small toolbox rested by his foot. He steadied the gate with one palm and guided the wrench with the other, tightening the bolt, as if making peace with an old friend. Footsteps sounded on the sidewalk. Linda Parker, clipboard in hand, walked toward him with two neighbors in tow. Their voices, light and easy, at first grew sharper as they neared the gate. Linda slowed, eyes narrowing at the patch on Walter's jacket, the oval of thread worn at the edges, silver stitching, barely visible in the dim morning. "Looks like some Navy mechanic patch knockoff, Walter," she said, her tone quick and dismissive. One of the neighbors gave a dry laugh. "Probably bought it at a flea market." The breeze answered with another groan from the gate, as if echoing the small sting of their words. Walter didn't look up right away. He finished setting the bolt before rising, wiping his hands on a cloth he kept in his back pocket. "Morning," he said quietly, as though the greeting could soften whatever had just landed between them. Another neighbor glanced from the patch to the hinge. "Trying to fix things again, huh? Might be best to leave it to the HOA this time." Walter only nodded, just keeping it from sticking. "Winter's coming." His voice held no argument, no defensiveness, simply a statement of fact, delivered with the warmth of someone who'd spent a lifetime solving small problems without asking for recognition. A smaller set of steps approached. Ethan, 12 years old and carrying a backpack too big for his frame, slowed as he reached the group. His eyes drifted straight to the patch on Walter's jacket. He leaned slightly forward, the wind pushing his hair across his forehead. "Mr. Hayes, that's a Navy mechanic patch, right?" he asked. Walter glanced down at the boy, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Just an old habit, son." Ethan looked closer. The morning light caught a slip of silver thread, no more than a thin shimmer, as if it wanted to be seen but wasn't ready to tell its full story. Linda's clipboard snapped lightly as she shifted it under her arm. "HOA rules say no unauthorized repairs," she began, though the words sounded less certain now. "We have procedures." Walter nodded again, the same gentle acknowledgement as before. "Understood." Ethan watched the way the man didn't argue, didn't push back, didn't explain. Something in that quiet steadiness made the boy's brows draw together, a small question forming behind his eyes. Walter picked up his toolbox and stepped aside, letting the gate settle into the breeze once more. Ethan lingered, glancing from the adults to the patch, sensing a truth tucked somewhere beneath the worn thread. Nobody knew the truth stitched beneath that faded thread. The bell over the door at Maple and Steam Diner jingled the same way it had for 30 years, soft, familiar, and a little tired, like an old friend, whose greeting never changed. The morning crowd was already settled in retirees with folded newspapers, A pair of mechanics in oil-smudged shirts and Mrs. Eller from the post office stirring too much sugar into her tea. Walter Hayes slipped into his usual booth by the window. The vinyl seat sighed under him as he eased down, setting his cap beside the salt shaker. The waitress, a woman named Carol, who had known him since his hair was more pepper than gray, appeared with a warm smile. "Top off for you, hun," she asked, already tilting the coffee pot. He nodded. "Thank you, Carol." The steam rose gently from the cup, curling into the chill still clinging to him from outside. He wrapped both hands around the mug, absorbing the heat, as if it could thaw the lingering ache from the gate scene earlier that morning. A moment later, the bell chimed again. Ethan stepped in with his mother brushing the cold from their sleeves. They scanned the room for an empty table, but seeing none, Ethan's mother guided him toward Walter's booth. "Would you mind sharing a seat, Mr. Hayes?" she asked. "Plenty of room," Walter said. Ethan slid in beside him, his backpack thumping lightly on the seat. His gaze drifted almost immediately to the patch on Walter's denim jacket, this time more visible in the warm diner light. The silver threads glinted faintly, two distinct lines catching the glow from the hanging bulbs above. "It really is a Navy mechanic star, isn't it?" Ethan asked quietly. Walter looked at him, the kind of look that held a lifetime of mornings, just like this one quiet, unhurried familiar. Some stories don't need telling every morning. Ethan frowned a little, not in frustration, but in the way a curious boy tries to understand the weight behind another person's words. At the counter, two mechanics talked just loud enough for their comments to carry. "Guy walks around like some ex-Navy engineer," one muttered. "Patch doesn't look regulation," the other replied. "Looks homemade." Their voices weren't harsh, just careless, yet somehow sharper than anything said at the gate. Ethan heard them too. He shifted closer to Walter, eyes narrowing, as if trying to shield him with silence alone. Walter didn't react. He just lifted his cup again, letting the warmth settle into his hands. The bell chimed a third time. Linda Parker stepped inside, her expression already tight. She spotted Walter immediately and marched toward the booth. "Walter Hayes," she began, "I need to remind you that any repairs to the neighborhood gate must go through HOA approval. You can't just tamper with property like that." "It was sticking," Walter said softly. "Didn't want it swinging loose." "That's not the point," Linda huffed. "There are rules." Carol glanced over from behind the counter, frowning at Linda's tone, but said nothing. Walter lowered his cup onto the table. His hand trembled by the slightest margin, so slight that no one else in the diner seemed to notice. But Ethan did. The boy's eyes softened, and something like understanding flickered across his face. Walter wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He was just tired. Tired in a way only someone who had spent years fixing things quietly could be. He nodded again, the gesture almost identical to the one he'd given at the gate. "I'll keep that in mind." Outside, a passing truck rattled the diner windows. Inside, the conversations resumed, but Ethan kept watching Walter, now more convinced than ever that there was far more truth in those silver stitches than anyone else bothered to see. The HOA hall always smelled faintly of folding chairs and floor polish, a scent that clung to the old boards no matter how many town events came and went. That evening, the room filled slowly, neighbors shrugging off coats, settling into metal chairs that scraped the floor with every movement. A low hum of conversation washed through the space as Linda Parker stood at the front table, flipping through her notes with clipped, impatient motions. Walter took a seat near the back, his denim jacket folded neatly in his lap. Ethan sat 2 rows ahead beside his mother, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. When the meeting finally came to order, Linda cleared her throat in the kind of way that signaled trouble before she even spoke. "We need to address an ongoing issue," she announced. specifically unauthorized tampering with neighborhood structures. And there's also been some concern. Her eyes locked onto Walter. That patch he wears might be stolen valor. A ripple ran through the room. One neighbor whispered not quietly enough, not even a real Navy mechanic. Another added, looks like something he stitched on himself. Ethan's brows tightened, a small crease forming between them. He looked toward Walter again, almost as if checking whether the man was hurt or merely enduring. Walter rose a little in his seat, but only enough for his voice to carry. I fix things, he said gently, because someone should. The simplicity of it hung in the air. Not defensive, not loud, just true. But the murmurs continued. Near the front, two men exchanged a hushed conversation. One leaned closer to the other. You know Coleman lives right near him. Back in the day, he ran the maintenance crew on a destroyer line. Man's eyes could spot a bad weld from 50 feet. The other nodded. Then he'd be the one to know if that patch is real. The mention drifted through the room unnoticed by most, but Ethan heard it. He tucked it away in that sharp young mind of his, storing it beside the memory of the silver stitches he'd glimpsed at the diner. The meeting trudged along with talk of leaves, trash schedules, and winter salt supplies. By the end, the earlier tensions still clung to the walls like dust that refused to be swept away. When the chairs were finally folded again, Walter slipped out quietly, offering a polite goodnight to anyone who met his gaze. Ethan hurried after him, slowing only when they reached the cool night air outside. At the post office the next afternoon, Walter stood in a short line with a small brown package tucked under his arm. The clerk, a woman who had sorted mail in Maple Ridge longer than Ethan had been alive, looked up with a warm grin. Well now, Walter, she said, stamping the counter. Still keep that mechanic's precision, huh? Everything of yours is squared neat as a pin. Walter chuckled softly. Hard habit to shake. Ethan, waiting near the postcard rack, watched as the jacket shifted when Walter reached for change. 3 silver lines gleamed briefly under the diner lights, more distinct now, carefully sewn, deliberate nothing like the careless claims people made about them. Something tightened in Ethan's chest, a feeling like he was standing at the edge of a moment he didn't fully understand yet. He sensed something was about to break open. The evening wind swept down Maple Ridge Lane the way it sometimes did, sudden, sharp, and strong enough to rattle porch chimes up and down the block. The neighborhood gate at the entrance gave a hard groan, then another, and with a sharp metallic pop, the right hinge tore loose. The whole frame shuddered, pitching just far enough to threaten the sidewalk, where kids usually biked at dusk. Walter was already on the move. He stepped out of his house with his old denim jacket zipped halfway and a small red toolbox dangling from one hand. Ethan jogged beside him, breath puffing in the cold air. Sir, it might fall, Ethan said. That's why we're here, Walter replied gently. When they reached the gate, the top bar wobbled under the force of the wind. Walter knelt, studying the torn hinge with the kind of quiet focus that gave Ethan chills. His hands moved steady, precise, checking alignment weight and stress points the way someone might read a familiar language. Linda burst out from her yard wrapped in a scarf, indignation leading the way. Touch that gate and I'll find you don't take another step, Walter Hayes. Walter paused, but only in the way someone pauses to let a storm finish its opening roar. Ethan swallowed hard. The wind rustled Walter's jacket just enough for the boy to see the faded lines of the mysterious patch again. And then, almost without thinking, Ethan reached toward the small wooden box he'd spotted inside Walter's toolbox earlier. It sat tucked between a wrench and a coil of wire carved from old walnut with tiny brass hinges. Sir, Ethan whispered. What's this? Fatarsa looked over. For a brief moment, something softened in his eyes. Go ahead. Ethan lifted the lid. Inside lay a patch unlike anything he'd ever seen. Silver wings curved around a set of polished tools, symbolic, elegant, unmistakably official. The stitching was tight and clean, the kind of craftsmanship that didn't come from flea markets or hobby stores. This was the real thing, the master-level rating of a Navy shipboard mechanic. Before Ethan could speak, footsteps echoed from the neighboring driveway. Admiral Coleman stepped into the glow of the street lamp, his breath catching in his chest, his eyes fixed on this patch in Ethan's hands, and everything in his expression shifted. The Admiral froze when he saw it. Ethan whispered under his breath. Absolutely froze. Coleman didn't blink, didn't breathe, as if the years between then and now had collapsed into a single point. He stepped closer, voice low and reverent. "I haven't seen that rating patch since the destroyer yard," he said, placing a hand gently against his own chest. "Master mechanic. Shipboard certification level. Only a handful of men earned that in my entire career." Linda's face drained of color. The other neighbors who had gathered behind her went silent. "Walter," she murmured. I didn't know." Walter kept his gaze on the broken gate. "You never asked," he said, tightening a bolt with slow, deliberate turns. Ethan looked between the men, between Walter, kneeling steady despite the wind, and Admiral Coleman standing tall, recognition written clear across every line of his face. The Admiral stepped closer, squatting, so his eyes were level with Walter's. "You kept it all this time," Coleman said quietly, "even after leaving the yard." "Some things don't leave you," Walter replied with a small smile, "even when the uniform does." More neighbors gathered, drawn by the commotion, their earlier whispers drying up like dust. The weight of the truth seemed to press the whole HOA line into stillness, rooted to the sidewalk, not by force but by realization. Across the street, porch lights flickered on one by one. A dog stopped barking. Even the wind seemed to pause, letting the moment settle. Ethan held the box carefully, reverently, as though it carried a history he suddenly understood mattered far more than he had guessed. Walter rose, brushed off his jeans, and reached for the hinge again. "Let's fix this," he said. And no one, Linda included, said another word. Evening settled softly over Maple Ridge as the last of the daylight stretched across Walter Hayes's porch. The old swing beneath him creaked in a familiar rhythm, moving with the slow back and forth of someone who wasn't rushing anywhere. The boards beneath his boots were warm from the sun, and a faint smell of cut grass drifted from a nearby yard. Walter rested both hands on his knees, just breathing in the quiet, something he'd never taken for granted. The neighborhood had a way of sounding different after a truth finally came to light. Softer, more careful, like folks had remembered how to listen again. Footsteps approached from the sidewalk. Linda Parker stood at the bottom of the porch steps, flanked by two HOA members who suddenly looked much smaller than the clipboards they always carried. Their eyes were lowered, their manner subdued, as though the wind from last night had blown more than just the gate loose. "Walter," Linda began, voice weighed down by something that wasn't quite shame and wasn't quite sorrow, but lived somewhere in between. "We wanted to stop by." Walter nodded once, not unkindly. "Evening." The younger HOA member cleared his throat. "We owe you an apology. All of us." Linda took a breath. "You kept this neighborhood running for years, and we treated you like you were meddling. Or worse." Walter's gaze drifted toward the repaired gate at the end of the street. "Folks get things wrong," he said. "Happens." "But this wasn't just a mistake," Linda insisted, stepping one rung higher on the porch. "We mocked your patch. We questioned your integrity. And we never should have." Walter didn't answer right away. The porch swing groaned softly beneath him, a small reminder that time has its own steady way of smoothing rough edges. From behind, Linda Ethan hurried up the walk with his mother close behind. The boy carried a framed photo in both hands, the one he had taken earlier that morning at the community board. "Mr. Hayes, look," he said, holding it out with a shy excitement. It was a clean, sharp picture of the master mechanic Patch, silver wings, gleaming tools crossed in the center, every stitch crisp. Beneath it, in careful block letters, the community board now read, "Honoring Walter Hayes, U.S. Navy Master Mechanic Service through Quiet Excellence." Walter blinked, the edges of his eyes softening. They didn't have to do that. "It felt right," Ethan said. "After everything." Linda nodded. "We printed 3 copies, one for the board, one for the town hall, and one for you." Ethan held the frame closer. The porch light caught it just right, making the silver thread shine. "Funny," Ethan murmured. "They mocked you at that very gate." Walter let out a breath that sounded half like a chuckle, half like something older. "Gates stick," he said. "People do too." The words drifted into the evening like warm smoke. Nobody spoke for a moment. Even the breeze paused long enough for the silence to settle, gentle and unforced. Ethan's mother put a hand on her son's shoulder, watching the exchange with a softness that hadn't been there days before. The older HOA man shifted his clipboard under his arm. "We're hosting a community day next week," he said quietly. "We'd be honored if you'd help lead the maintenance walkthrough. Only if you want to." Walter tilted his head, the corner of his mouth lifting. "We'll see," he replied. "I'm not much for speeches." "You don't need speeches," Ethan said. "You've got this." He tapped the glass gently right over the patch in the photograph. Emotion flickered across the boy's face, earnest, bright, and full of the kind of admiration that didn't have to be spoken aloud to be true. The porch swing creaked again as Walter set a hand on the frame, steadying it. "Take care of that for me, son," he said softly. "I will," Ethan promised. From the sidewalk, neighbors slowed long enough to wave or nod. The echo of last night's reveal had moved through town, not like gossip, but like something that pulled people forward instead of apart. And as dusk deepened, the swing rocked in its easy rhythm, carrying the weight of justice, not loud, not sharp, but warm, settled, and finally understood. The Saturday sun fell warmly across Maple Ridge Town Hall as neighbors gathered for a small ceremony. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, comforting in the way familiar spaces often are. Folks moved slowly, stopping in front of the newly mounted plaque near the entrance. In clean, steady lettering it read, "Quiet hands keep us safe." Beneath it hung the framed photograph of Walter Hayes's Navy mechanic master patch, the silver wings shining under the morning light. People paused there, whispering softly, their faces touched by something close to respect. Walter stood off to the side, hands tucked loosely in the pockets of his denim jacket, watching the small crowd with a quiet expression. If anything, he looked a little embarrassed by the attention. He'd spent most of his life fixing things, not standing in front of plaques about fixing things. Ethan pushed through the doorway with a kind of proud urgency. The new walnut box, smaller but carefully crafted, was tucked under his arm. "Mr. Hayes," he said, slightly breathless, "they're ready for you." Walter nodded and followed him toward the front of the room. Children hushed, adults turned, and the mayor stepped aside to give Walter space. He took the box from Ethan's hands and opened it. Resting inside was a replica of the master mechanic patch, clean stitches, bright silver thread, the tools crossed beneath the wings, just like the original. Walter held it up gently. "This is for you," he said to Ethan. So you remember real work rarely announces itself. Ethan's eyes went wide. For me, Walter nodded. Someone showed me once. Now I'm showing you. The room settled into a warm silence. Ethan ran a thumb lightly along the edge of the patch, almost reverent. After a moment, he looked up. It's strange, he whispered. They mocked your jacket patch, but the Admiral froze because he knew exactly who you were. Walter smiled, small, kind, and humble, in the way only someone who has earned things quietly can smile. It was never about the patch, he said, just about doing the job right. People see what they see. Across the room, Admiral Coleman gave a slow, approving nod. Linda and the other HOA members stood near the back, their expressions softer than Walter had ever seen them. Ethan held the patch close against his chest. "I'll take good care of it," he said. "I know you will," Walter replied. As the crowd began to drift outside, conversations warmed by understanding rather than judgment. The repaired neighborhood gate stood straight against the breeze, no longer a symbol of conflict, but of how things had changed. Walter stepped out into the sunlight with Ethan at his side. The morning felt brighter, steadier, like the town had finally caught up to the truth stitched into those silver wings. If this story moved you, share it forward. The town hall felt warmer, that morning sunlight glinting off the new plaque, as Walter stood quietly beside Ethan, the faint creak of the old floorboards settling under their boots. Still, the boy kept touching the replica patch Walter had passed to him, its silver wings catching the light like a small lamp in a winter window. Before whispering that people may have mocked the jacket once, but the Admiral had frozen because he knew exactly who stood behind that faded thread. And as neighbors drifted past the plaque, with soft nods and kinder eyes, Walter simply rested a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder, letting the truth speak for itself in the quiet way real work always does.